Welcome to Shards of Illumination, a series that focuses on a plethora of subjects ranging from ancient history all the way through to current events that are shaping our modern world. Our expert in the hot seat is Ralph Ellis. Ralph is the author of 10 books on ancient and biblical history. In his 4-part trilogy on the historical Jesus, Ralph has produced an extraordinary theological discovery, the true identity and genealogy of the biblical Jesus. In addition, Ralph has a peer-reviewed scientific paper on the causes of ice ages. In this, our second episode, Ralph and I will be discussing the future of the British monarchy after the passing of the Queen, and we'll be taking a close look at the Mar-Thoma Syro-Malabar Church in Kodungalor, India. The church was founded by St Thomas, or Judas Thomas Didymus, in AD 52. Didymus in Greek means twin, and many scholars believe that Thomas was the twin brother of Jesus. This is a fascinating new line of research that we believe has the potential to add further credence to Ralph's Edessan theory. Do please like, share, comment and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps us out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you for your continued support. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Shards of Illumination series. I'm your host Paul, and with us as always is friend to the channel Ralph Ellis. How are you, Ralph, today?
Yeah, very well. Monsignor Ralph Ellis this time, so I keep changing my titles, but there we go. I'm not sure if that's a promotion or a demotion, but there we go.
Okay, so Ralph, we've been asked by a couple of viewers to talk about the passing of the Queen this week. Obviously, she's presided over a long period of history and a fascinating period of history. So can you share with us your thoughts on the passing of the Queen, and how do you view the future of the monarchy?
Yes, well, I suppose it's sad, but I don't think it really is sad. I mean, if you reach 96 and you've been at the top of your game for 70 years, you can't really call it sad. I mean, that's almost a celebration, isn't it? That I mean, let's not think that the Queen would never pass. She was going to pass. So yeah, let's celebrate her life rather than being sad about it. And let's not be critical like some of these horrible left-wingers that are being utterly critical when they don't even understand the system. That's been a black mark on the whole of the week, I think, especially the Americans being like that. So just for readers and listeners, so they know where I sort of stand on this, I've always been a quiet royalist, basically. I don't go out and celebrate, but I appreciate the institution. And so I hope the institution survives. You know, some people don't like it because they say it's expensive. We don't need it. It's out of date. You know, we don't need it in the 21st century, but I don't agree. I think it's a good value for money with the amount of revenue that the monarchy brings into the country is enormous, and it far outweighs the cost of having a monarchy in terms of trade, in terms of tourism. You know, when the Queen, or will it be now the King, goes abroad, it's as much for trade as it is for tourism and for the monarchy itself. You know, their connections throughout the former empire ensure that we get an awful lot of trade with those nations. So yeah, the monarchy more than pays for itself, and it gives Britain standing within the world that it wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, who is going to celebrate Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or that wet week known as Theresa May. I mean, for goodness sake, I mean, she could not stride upon the world stage and put Britain first within, world politics and the world in general, like the Queen
Sorry,
did.
Ralph, but at the same time, the Queen wasn't really a political animal, was she? She didn't
No,
really immerse herself in the politics of the day.
no, yes and no. Her job was to stay out of politics, of course, but being the primary sort of being the monarch of the country, the prime. I was going to say prime minister, but she is obviously not. But the prime person within the nation, she obviously has a political place, even though she's non-political. And that role, I think, was essential in the maintenance of Britain as a democracy, as a um, as a beacon of reasonableness within the world. The whole point of our democracy that we've evolved, which is why I hate people tampering with it, is that it produces reasonable governments. So we don't end up with tyrants. That's the whole point of it. And there are many ways you can do that, but you've got to make a way of ensuring that you don't get tyrants in control of your country. Now, in America, they try and do that with a presidential system by ensuring that the president can only reign for 4 years and a maximum of 2 terms, and then you're out. The trouble being that, of course, that anyone who's in a position of power for too long tends to go towards tyranny. As they always say, power corrupts, and ultimate power corrupts ultimately. And so you want to try and prevent that. So you don't want a President Xi of China or Putin in Russia or Kim in North Korea who end up as being tyrants. And you've seen that, everybody has seen that recently with Putin. He was a reasonable fellow, seemed great, as a leader, a tough leader, which is what Russia always needed. He was just the right sort of person. But then he stayed too long and too long and too long. And then he thinks he's master of the world and decides to invade Ukraine. You see the problems. If Russia had managed to have a way of getting rid of Putin after, say, 10 years maximum, Russia would have been okay. But they didn't. They didn't have that system. He circumvented that system, first by making himself mayor of Moscow or something. No, he became prime minister, didn't he? He served his 2 terms as president, so he became prime minister and then went back to being president again, which they shouldn't have allowed because they just were boosting a tyrant. And that's the whole point of politics. You need to stop that from happening. And the way that we've done it in Britain, because we have a slightly different system, we have a 5-year presidency, as it were, with the prime minister. But you can have an unlimited number of terms. So that's could be a problem. If you get a tyrannical prime minister who takes over the party and therefore takes over the nation and sits there for 5 or 6 terms, 30 years, you can have a problem. And the way we've sorted out that particular problem is that the prime minister is not top dog. Technically, in terms of politics, he or she is, because there is no one above the prime minister. However, the prime minister is still subservient to the monarch. And so the prime minister still has to go once a week to the monarch and bow or curtsy before the Queen. It's just reminding that person that no matter how much power they think they have within the political system, they are not top dog. They still
Well,
have to bow to a superior person within the nation.
the monarch has the power to shut down Parliament and start wars, I believe. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if she can start a war, but certainly she technically has the power to close down Parliament. Yes,
Did she not shut down the?
dissolve Parliament,
Did she not shut down the Canadian Parliament a few years back?
and the Australian one as well. I mean, that's probably 50 years ago or so now. But yes, they shut down the Australian Parliament for whatever reason. I can't remember the reason for that. And yes, I think they've done it to the Canadians as well. So yes, she sort of still does have ultimate power that's wielded very cautiously, I would imagine, because you don't want to do that sort of too often. So yes, I suppose even within Britain, she had the power to close down Parliament if she thought there was a good reason for doing so, if there was a tyrant around. But at the very least, the Prime Minister has to bow or curtsy to the Queen. You are not the top dog here. The Queen is. And you have to sit there and listen to an ear wagging from the Queen if she disagrees with your policies. So although she's not supposed to be political, and I've no doubt she would conduct those meetings in a sort of non-political manner, but I'm sure she was very critical on some occasions with some of these prime ministers.
Well,
In fact, we know that she was.
she had a very strained relationship with Margaret Thatcher, didn't she?
Yes, because there you have two top dogs together.
Hmm.
Very difficult when you get two people who think they are really in charge. And of course, Thatcher thought she was really in charge. And I dare say that Thatcher hated having to go to the Queen and curtsy before the Queen. But that's her role. No matter how tyrannical Thatcher was thinking she was, she still had to curtsy before the Queen and be quiet and listen to the Queen instead of, because you can imagine someone like Thatcher wants to just talk over everybody all the time, as we see on YouTube quite a lot. But she would have to sit there before the Queen and be quiet and listen. And that is where the constitutional monarchy comes into play. It's a way of ensuring that we get stability within the nation. So for whatever it costs us to have a constitutional monarchy, in terms of maintaining stability within politics, I think it's well worth the value. As long as you get, a reasonable monarch, of course, that's always the problem. You've got this monarch that you might get a bad one every now and then because it's through inheritance, not through a vote. However, the political party in charge still has power over the Queen in some respects. So the monarch has to be careful not to push things too far. Otherwise, they might have a vote within Parliament for the dissolution of the monarchy. So there's always this power struggle between the two, which is exactly what you want. It's like the power struggle between, the House and the Senate in America. You really do want them arguing between each other to make sure that nobody has complete power on their own. We sort of have the same in Britain with the Parliament and the Lords, which is sort of like our Senate. It's not quite as I don't think the Lords are quite as powerful as the Senate is in America, but they are a moderating force on anything that comes through Parliament. But then whatever acts are created by the House of Commons, they have to go through the House of Lords first to get rubber stamped there, and they can make changes. And then they have to go before the monarch. So they don't become law until they go before the monarch and get rubber stamped. Now, as far as I know, the Queen has never thrown something back and said, no, try again, we don't want that law. But I'm sure words have been had when the Prime Minister goes to see the monarch. So, these are the new laws that have come out this week. Well, do you really think this is a good law? In their weekly meetings, So, yeah, I think it's a system that works. There was a time back in the 1990s, early 2000s, when Tony Blair was in power, and he was thinking he was God. Literally, he was saying things that sort of, because he was religious, and we don't normally have religious people in Parliament, and he was saying things that were indicating he thought he was God, or the Son of God, or something of that nature. He was going that far. And there were rumors around that they wanted to dissolve the monarchy because there were quite a few Republicans within the Labour Party. And then Diana died.
I was going to say, Ralph, he changed the House of Lords, didn't he, with the peerage?
Yeah, the House of Lords was largely by inheritance, and he stopped that. So it became elected, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how it's elected anymore. I think it's elected by the MPs in the House of Commons, which is not really an election. So the political makeup of the House of Lords tends to reflect the political parties within the Commons, which is not the best way of doing it. You want a different character within the House of Lords to what is in the House of Commons. Otherwise, they'll just rubber stamp things without actually arguing against them, if they're bad laws. But Blair was looking towards getting rid of the monarchy because they were Republicans. And then Diana died. And suddenly there were millions and millions of people on the streets mourning the death of Diana, of course. And at that point, I think Blair suddenly realized that he just could not compete with that system. There's no way in the world that Blair could get, 10 million people out on the streets. He just did not have that.
Well, he came close
that
to
history,
it.
that charisma.
He came close to getting 10 million people on the streets when he threatened to invade Iraq, didn't he?
Yes, yes, but when Diana died, of course, there were millions out on the streets, and there was no way that that Tony Blair could compete with that. He just did not have the tradition, the fellowship of the people, within the heart of the nation that the monarchy did. And I think he saw at that point that there's no way he could compete with it. Republican or not, the monarchy was going to survive because Parliament cannot produce a figurehead that had the popularity of the monarch. And so it survived. So that was back in the noughties. And so, 20 years later, we're still here with the monarchy. And there is no serious challenge to it ever since, for the last 20 years, through good and bad, because of course the monarchy has had periods of things that they probably regretted, you might say. But the monarchy is still there as strong as ever because the nation sort of needs a figurehead.
Possibly,
and while the
sorry to interject, but at the same time, I do understand what you're saying there. But at the same time, there is a growing number of people in this country that are becoming or are anti-royal. So that must be a significant issue for the royals.
Oh, it is, but I think sentiment was against them more in the 90s and early 2000s than it is now. There was a large Republican sentiment within the Labour Party, which spread amongst all of the left wing within the country. I don't think that exists so much now, because the Labour Party doesn't know what it stands for anymore. It used to be the party of the working classes, which it doesn't appear to be anymore. It appears to be the party of the chattering classes within the London aristocracy, the left-wing aristocracy within London, and it has virtually no connection whatsoever with the working classes anymore. They simply don't represent, although they're funded by the trade unions anymore, they don't really represent the wills, the hopes and desires and the will of the working classes. And so those working classes now are more inclined to be royalist than they were back in the 1990s. I think the real threat, to the monarchy now, it comes from the immigrant classes, who don't appreciate the Queen because they are essentially not a part of British society. So if you look at the people, both at the Jubilee, the recent Jubilee of the Queen, and now at the passing of the Queen, if you look at the crowds, they are overwhelmingly white British, with noticeable by their absence is no blacks, which I'm surprised about. Apart from if you look at the BBC have obviously gone around the crowds to find the only people who might be immigrants and put them, center stage. Because if you look at anything online, the crowds are noticeably absent from blacks for some reason. I thought there would be more monarchists than that within the black community.
Well,
very few.
Sorry, Ralph, didn't Prince William and Kate Middleton have to cancel their tour of the Caribbean recently?
Yeah, what was the reasons for that? I didn't see the reason. I don't keep up to date.
I think the reason was that the people in those countries didn't really want any sort of connection to royalty anymore. They just,
Yes, they've jumped onto this bandwagon, this Democrat bandwagon, I think, from America, that everything has to do with race and everything has to do with slavery. But I think that is propaganda from America. It doesn't reflect really the history of the black people in the Caribbean or America or even in Britain, that everything has to do with slavery. They don't seem to realize that the main slavers were the black people in Africa, who were the people who actually organized the slave trade and actually brought the people to the ports so they could be taken out on the ships. They never seem to mention that. And they never seem to mention that it was Britain who stopped the slave trade. Something like 30 years before Americans did. And we were the people who policed the oceans to make sure that the slave trade was finally abolished at great cost to the nation, that we were not trading with people who still had slaves, that the Royal Navy was still going around all of the oceans, actually interceding and stopping any slavers that were still operating at great cost, with vast numbers of people killed in order to stop the slave trade. And yet no thanks whatsoever for a trade that had been going on for millennia. Strange idea that the slave trade was British. The slave trade had been going on ever since man arrived, as Homo sapien. People have been taken into slavery. Obviously, the Roman system worked upon slaves. It was the only way it could work, because, again, they seem to not realize that we have only managed to get away from slavery because we have enslaved machines and we have enslaved fossil fuels. They are the modern slaves. They do the work that we could not do unless you had a slave industry to actually do that work. And yet these very same people are the very same people who want to get rid of fossil fuels, who are the alternate slaves that we use today. Every barrel of oil contains the work of 15,000 man-hours of work in every barrel of oil. That's who we've enslaved recently through the technology that Britain evolved during the Industrial Revolution. Lots of themes that we've talked about before. And you cannot be against slavery and against fossil fuels, or against a replacement of fossil fuels that will actually work, because the only way to run a nation otherwise is to reintroduce slavery, to do the work that needs to be done if you don't have the machines to do it. And as another point of note, which people seem to forget completely, is some of the worst slave traders in the 18th and 19th centuries were the Barbary pirates in North Africa. And the Barbary pirates took 1 million blonde Europeans, white Europeans, into slavery. One of the biggest and worst of the slave trades ever, because they were treated in the most disgusting manner by the Barbary pirates, who then sold them onto the slave markets in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. And the Middle Eastern slave markets were at the same time taking slaves from East Africa. There was a huge slave trade in African slaves from East Africa. That's where the main main market for slaves was in the Middle East, and they were treated very, very badly over there. Nobody seems to mention that whatsoever, but that's the truth of the matter. Is that the American slave trade was only one portion of a very large slave trade,
and of
which
course
the British ended.
And of course, the Irish, many of the Irish were used as slaves, weren't they, around that time as well?
I'm not sure if they were used as slaves. I mean, Britain had a lot of indentured people, which some people equate with slavery. But of course, indenture is not slavery. If people don't understand the system, you are taken for a fixed period of time as a serf, you might say. But once you've worked out your allotted period of time, it's normally quite a long time. It's something like 10 years or 15 years. Then you become a free person. And people might say, oh, that's terrible. You can't do that. Well, I'm sorry. That's how our army, all of our armed forces in Britain, operate. You are indentured. When you join the army, you sign on for a certain amount of time. Now, if you're a common soldier, it's a short amount of time. It's 3 years or 5 years. But if you go into one of the trades where you have to pay back your education in that particular trade, it might be 12 years. And so you're indentured for 12 years and you must stay with them until you're made free at the end of your fixed period. We still run the same system. If you join as a pilot, for instance, in the Royal Air Force, when I was young, the indentured period was 12 years for a pilot, in order that you would pay back the amount of training you had had to get your wings in the first place. So Britain ran that system for quite some time, and there was an awful lot of people from India they took as indentured people. They were not slaves. They signed on. I'm not entirely sure how voluntary it was, but I can imagine that a lot of people would want to sign on, because you would be taken to another country, you would work there for the British for a number of years, and then you would be set up in this new location and have the rest of your life, and you can have your family, and then you could become successful in that particular region. which is why you see so many Indians around Africa and so on that were taken there as indentured peoples. And they've done very nicely from it, you know. The Indians in Uganda and Kenya and various places like that, you know, South Africa, there's quite a few. So yes, that well, without getting onto the subject of slavery, that came about because there's a lack of people from Black community and Muslim community who were celebrating or mourning the death of the Queen, and the recent Jubilee, of course, which is a problem, because that is not only a snub to the monarchy, it's a snub to Britain as well, that you're not a part of this nation. You live in a separate society that's completely separate to Britain. It's no longer a Britain, it's a multicultural Britain which is not standing together. There is no unity within the nation. I think the only people I noticed within the crowds that seemed to be present in large numbers were the Sikh community. And that's not so surprising, because the Sikh community were a community within India that didn't have their own homeland. So they were a bit of a persecuted sort of minority within India. And of course, Britain, when they went to India, saw that as an opportunity and befriended the Sikhs and put them into the army. Because they're more likely to be loyal to Britain if they had no particular loyalty to the Indian system. And they were. So during the Second World War, in the Eastern British Army, fighting against the Japanese, 60% of the Indian army were Sikhs operating for Britain, because they appreciated Britain as being their, you know, sort of saviors and guardians. And so they were working for Britain within the British Army. And so I think the Sikhs have a much closer relationship with Britain and the monarchy than do most of these other peoples. So yeah, you don't see the divisions and the tensions within society until something like this happens, and then you suddenly see who your supporters are within the nation. So yeah, that's been interesting. But yeah, I hope that the institution does survive. I'm not very keen on Big Ears becoming the next king.
So yeah, I was going to ask you, Ralph, moving forward, what do you think? What do you think about the monarchy, the future of the monarchy moving forward now?
It does depend on who becomes the next monarch, and unfortunately, Charlie Boy is a woke idiot. I mean, he never had a decent education. He hated his education. He was thrown into this private school up in Scotland, which I forget the name of actually, but it was a very tough schooling.
Yeah.
Because Philip had been there, Phil the Greek had been there when he was a child. And is it Gordonston? I think it's Gordonston, isn't it? And he hated it because he was not a tough child, as you can see. He was a bit of a wet lettuce, and he didn't get on at that school.
And then he went to Eton, didn't he? Which is the highest fee-paying school in the world, I think, and failed every single one of his exams.
Yes, he did not do very well at all. And yet this person now is going to become the new monarch. And you think, oh my goodness, can't we just skip a generation, you know?
Ralph, apologies for this, but you're saying that Charles is woke, and I can understand why you're saying that, because a lot of the policies that he backs are very much woke. But you're tying in wokeism with Marxism, and here we are talking about the King of England. So all of a sudden, my brain is like, I don't compute. this is not making any real sense on the surface. I mean, surely the King of England isn't a Marxist.
Yeah, but it never does make sense. This is the problem with Marxism. It never makes sense. The people who support it are the most ignorant idiots you've ever seen, and they are total hypocrites.
We've seen, sorry, Ralph,
completely, always.
we've seen the destruction of the family unit probably since the late 1950s, 1960s. Is this in any way what it's all about? Is making people more vulnerable to control and manipulation? And is that
it could well be, yes, because
it's coming from?
Yeah, the nuclear family, as they like to call it nowadays, you know, the vibrant, cohesive unit of the family and the wider family that you have is a danger to some of these people. It's a danger to Marxists. They want to divide people so they can be controlled by the state. And if you want the state controlling people, you don't want strong families who are going to oppose the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Marxism has always hated the family.
So
but yes, you always get...
Sorry, why is King Charles then backing these policies? To me, that seems very odd on the surface.
Yeah, because they're hypocrites. A good anecdote from a while ago. This is during the time of Tony Blair, and of course Tony Blair was against the private school system, wanted to close down the private schools in Britain, like Eton and all Gordonston, all of these very famous private schools. He wanted to close them down. He was the Labour Prime Minister, and one of the prime architects of this, one of the prime aristocrats within the Labour Party, was a lady called Peggy. She's very famous. I won't say who she is. But apparently Peggy was talking to people in a party, and someone said to her, well, Peggy, I thought you wanted to close down all the private schools and have comprehensive government schools, but your children go to a private school. And she said, oh, my dear, we don't experiment with our own children.
Incredible.
And that's what you get. And you get the same with Diane Abacus. Again, a prominent Labour MP and not a peer. Has she become a peer? No, I don't think she has. She's just a member of the cabinet of the Labour Party. And she, again, was totally anti the private school system, wanted it all closed down, campaigned against it solidly for years and years and years. Where did she send her child to? She sent her child to a private school. Having campaigned against private schools for 20 years, this utter hypocrite sent her son to a private school.
Well, doesn't this illustrate, Ralph, that the whole system is rotten to its core? I mean, it's just so it's so full of hypocrisy, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And open hypocrisy as well. I mean, how can you do? I just don't think I could do that. I couldn't campaign against something for 20 years and then go against it when it suits me.
Yeah.
I mean, has she got no principles? Has she got no shame?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what they do. And so you do get these rich, influential, aristocratic Marxists who think they are so superior, and yet they are the very people that Marxism wants to destroy. And yet they go along with it, and you wonder why. And I think it's just because they are idiots. They do it in order to appear as though they're nice, caring people, but really they're just hypocrites. And I think Charlie Boy is one of these things. You know, he's campaigning against fossil fuels. He's a you know, an uber greenie who wants to, you know, care for the environment and get rid of fossil fuels, because if we just have organic farming, everything will be fine. Yeah, well, Sri Lanka has just, you know, shown us that that doesn't. I don't know if people know, but Sri Lanka went green, and they banned all fertilizers, and suddenly the output from the farms crashed by 50%, and now they're all starving in Sri Lanka. Yeah, that's what it actually produces. But of course, Charlie Boy is so brain dead, he doesn't know the difference. I mean, the guy thinks lockdowns are wonderful. You know, we should just stay in our houses. Yeah, but you've got a 600-acre estate, mate. You don't live in a one-bedroom flat like.
And 30 or 40 different private jets as well that he, you know, flies around the world in, lecturing everyone on climate change. I mean,
Yes.
again, this is the hypocrisy, and it's it doesn't seem to be just politicians now. You know, there's royalty getting involved. He seems to be very closely aligned to Klaus Schwab of the WEF. Which is quite worrying, I think, because I mean, how much? I don't want to sort of digress too much, but how much? How much are you concerned with this idea of the Great Reset?
Well, certainly Charlie Boy is very aligned with that, because he actually appeared on a video promoting the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, saying you will own nothing and you will be happy. And this is a monarch saying this to us who lives in a mansion with a 600-acre estate. And he's telling us that we will own nothing. Does he not see the hypocrisy in that? Is he really going to give up his mansion and his 600-acre estate?
Well, is there any surprise that many people now are just calling the royals a plutocratic cult, basically? You know, because of this level of hypocrisy.
But that's the trouble with having the wrong royal in a position of power. It was okay when Queenie was there. Because you could see that, okay, she had palaces and she had all the trappings of the aristocracy, but she really cared for the people. Then you come to Charlie Boy and you think, well, he's got all the trappings of power, but he doesn't give a shit about us. He really doesn't. Or rather, he doesn't have the intelligence to know what is good for us, what is good for the people, because that's his job. His job is to do the best for the people. We've talked about this before, where the Roman emperors always allied themselves with the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, because it was the primary job of the emperor to make sure that the people had enough of whatever it happened to be, food, you know, clothing, all of the necessities of life, water with the great aqueducts. The emperor provided all of the needs of the people. And Charlie Boy doesn't seem to understand that. He wants us to go all organic farming. Well, that's great for him on his 600-acre estate. I'm sure he can easily feed himself. But what about the rest of us, chum? Britain barely is able to feed itself, even using all of the trappings of, you know, monoculturalism and I didn't say that right, did I? Monoculture of crops and so on, and all of the fertilizers we use, the fossil fuel fertilizers.
Right. Again, I don't want to digress too much, Ralph, but there are many problems with this. These mega fields, these monocultures of crops, and the way that we farm on an industrial level. There are so many problems with it, you know. And on this channel, we're a big advocate of growing your own food, and I really do believe that could be the answer. You know, we all dig up our lawns and start growing vegetables and fruits.
Yeah, but I mean, the modern world doesn't work like that anymore. I mean, we could do that in the Second World War because we had houses with gardens. Most people now don't seem to have gardens. I don't have a garden. All of the people in flats, we can't do this. We've
There
now
are,
stuffed the country full of so many people, it's just not possible.
you
We
know,
can't even feed ourselves now at present. And while our organics sounds great, you will reduce the output by at least 40%.
but increase the
And that has,
quality. But
sorry,
you'll also increase the quality of the food by going organic.
you may well, probably undoubtedly, but we need the protein. We need to be able to feed the people. And okay, if we're not feeding the people, then we've got to import it. But where are we going to import it from? Well, we import it from America, and they only manage to produce that amount of food because they have these big industrial farms and monoculture. The problem is there's too many people on the planet. You cannot feed 8 billion people with small organic farms. It's just not going to work. And that's why we have large agricultural industrial monoculture in order to feed the world.
The only trouble with that, sorry, Ralph, but the only trouble with that is it goes against nature. It really
Oh,
does go
it
against nature.
does, yeah.
And
Yeah, of course it does.
Hmm.
But so does having 8 billion people on the planet go against nature. Back in the 1970s, I said we should stabilize the population at about 4 billion, which we were running up to. Well, we've gone straight through that completely. And if people want to go on increasing the population, as many people do, then you have to be able to arrange your agriculture appropriately.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because how can we possibly impose some sort of law or some sort of, I don't know, where you could try to get people to procreate less or whatever and try and cap the population without becoming tyrannical, you know?
Well, we were doing it quite well naturally in Britain until they opened the immigration floodgates. The population of Britain had stabilized and was falling because the average procreation, I think we were getting about 1.8, I think, children per family, whatever, per couple. The population of Britain would have decreased so slowly over the generations. But then we had people like Tony Blair open up the floodgates to immigration, and now we've gone to 70 million.
So
Yeah.
I would definitely agree with you that our country is definitely overpopulated. There's no question
Oh,
about
yes.
that.
Yeah,
But
hugely.
I'm not convinced about the world being overpopulated. I'm not so sure about that. I think I've mentioned to you before that
Yeah.
it's a fact that you could fit everybody in the world into the state of Texas, give them an acre of land each, and the rest of the globe would be empty. So are we really overpopulated?
Well, there's a lot of parts of the world that we cannot inhabit. I mean, the vast amount of Russian Asia is just not able to be populated. The vast amount of Australia cannot be populated because of a
Well,
lack of water.
I've heard that the Chinese are currently changing their desert into arable land, with modern technology. So all sorts of different methods there. So I think with the advancement in technology, surely anything is possible.
Yeah,
I
but one
just
of those advancements in technology is industrial agriculture, which is exactly what we've done.
okay.
We still need the amount of food we require. We still only just, with all of the land that we've got under agriculture, we still just about only feed all of the population. It's not as if we have much spare land that we can use. But now, of course, they want to use that agriculture for fuel as well. And of course, that's eating into the amount of agriculture we've got left to feed people because we're sticking it into biofuels, which are utterly ridiculous. I've still not seen any paper that indicates that it's worthwhile doing that. Most of the papers say that I've read on biofuels that it takes a liter of fuel, fossil fuel, from the ground, to create a liter of biofuel, because there is so many industrial processes required from the growing, the fertilizers. Again, we come back to fertilizers to grow the food, to actually harvest it with all machinery you require, to then process it and ferment it and make it into industrial alcohol to add to the fuel. By the time you've done all of that, you've used a liter of petrol in order to make a liter of biofuels. It's just simply just not worth the effort. I saw a wonderful video. You can find some good things on YouTube occasionally. And there was this farmer in America who was growing grain for industrial alcohol, because it's big in America. They've got to have something like 20% of your fuel has to come from biofuels. And he said, this is the equipment I've got. And again, we're coming to industrial farms yet again. And he had this hangar that was bigger than any factory you've seen. And all of the machines he had in this hangar for producing grain. I think he was mostly growing maize. And this hangar was full of machinery that he couldn't even touch the top of the wheels, because the wheels were like 2.5, 3 meters high. I mean, this was vast machinery consuming thousands and thousands of liters of, diesel fuel every day, to actually farm his thousands of acres of land that he had. That's what you take to grow that amount of food and then turn it into biofuels. I mean, it's just an utter nonsense. But this is the sort of technology and the direction that Charlie Boy wants to go, because he doesn't know any different. And the trouble is, if he's wrong, and I do think he's wrong, he will end up starving the world, because he knows no better.
Well, there's too many people in the world.
Yeah.
So perhaps.
Well, maybe that's what they want to do, but they should have done this years ago. We could have stabilized the population 50 years ago, but they didn't. And then we could have stabilized our own local population, and they didn't. They opened the floodgates to the whole of the world, and then they wonder where we're going to put everybody, how we're going to feed them, how are we going to even get them on the transport, because you can't go on a motorway now because it's ram-packed with cars, because everybody now has a car. Nobody was thinking ahead, 50 years ago, when this could have been stabilized, and we could have had a better environment, and we could have had more organic agriculture. But we can't, because they forgot the main thing, which is the number of people you've got to feed. You've got to feed them. And when you go around places, like if you go to India and Pakistan and all of these places, and you think, well, can you fit all of those people into a smaller space? Well, everywhere you go in India, it's just teeming with people. You don't get vast areas of open space in India. You really don't. And they've all got to be fed somehow. So yeah, a bit of a diversion from the Queen and the Commonwealth. But
just getting back to King Charles III. I think it's fair to say that we're a little bit, we're pretty concerned about what might unfold under his monarchy. And just to finish up on this, the monarchy as a whole and the future of the monarchy, is it bleak? Is it positive? How do you read it?
Well, I hope that Charlie Boy can abdicate and allow William to come in, because I think he's got a lot more common sense. I think that couple together will do a much better job than Charlie Boy will. You never know, because their brother is utterly stupid, Ginge and Cringe are the very worst people you would ever want
Mm.
to be on the throne in the position that they have.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine Ginge and Cringe there? I mean, that would be the end of the monarchy.
Mm. Absolutely.
But William and Kate, I think they would actually be very good in that role. But I have no great faith that Charlie Boy will actually do a good job.
Mm.
The only saving grace is that our new energy minister in Britain has pledged to get as many fossil fuels out of the ground as possible. So going totally against what Charlie Boy wants.
Mm.
Now, I'm not entirely, well, we've spoken about this before, I think, but I'm not wholly in favor of fossil fuels because they are a stopgap.
Mm.
You know, they will run out. We've already run out of coal. We've already run out of oil. We passed peak coal back in 1920, I think it was, and we passed peak oil back in 1990.
Mm.
And by peak, I mean when things get more and more expensive every year because there's less and less of the easy stuff to get out of the ground.
Mm.
And you look at the size of the North Sea oil fields, they're all so thin nowadays in comparison with the Brent, you know, which was the huge oil field that started the oil in the North Sea. All of the new fields are just microscopic in comparison. Same with oil. Same with coal. People say we've got 300 years of coal in this country. Yeah, but it's difficult. And I know about this because I used to work down coal mines. I was a surveyor. I didn't do very much of it. I was at college at the time. And we used to go down the coal mines because that was going to be our job. And the coal mines were all very, very deep, very, very thin coal seams. We're talking about a coal seam of about 1 meter. And that's all you're digging out. You're 2,000 foot below ground.
Mm.
And all you're digging is a meter of coal. And then you only dig 100 meters and you've got a fissure and the whole thing jumps up or down by 2 meters. And you've got to rearrange all of the cutting heads to go down 2 meters or up 2 meters to meet where the seam has just jumped to because it's all fissured. So, yeah, Britain will never be independent using fossil fuels, and we have to move our way away from fossil fuels. And under the guidance of Charlie Boy, I don't think we'll ever achieve that. So I'm hoping that this new Minister for Energy can push us towards sustainable energy in terms of more like nuclear, not renewables. We've reached almost the peak of what we can do with renewables because nobody has started to construct and build any backup facilities, any storage facilities. And without those storage facilities, renewables will be useless. And so we need the new sort of energy minister to push towards building some storage facilities, but also pushing more and more into a nuclear direction because fossil fuels will run out. We will have a severe lack of them over the next 20, 30 years. So yeah, that's the direction that I hope the monarchy will sort of assist with and not go against. But anyway,
Absolutely.
That's my thoughts.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you. Let's move on to our next subject today. The Mar-Thoma Syro-Malabar Catholic Church in modern-day Kodungalor in India. I think I said that right. This is a fascinating new line of research, Ralph. Can you enlighten us as to what you have discovered so far? And does this new discovery have the potential to add even more credence to the Edessan theory?
Yes, I think it does. There's quite a lot of information come to light which I hadn't known about before, and no one seems to have mentioned in the chats either when I've been discussing this, that there is evidence for an Edessan church within India that was set up by Thomas. They call St Thomas.
Please
Now, this is
continue,
a
Ralph.
part.
I'm just going to share the screen and show some images of the church while you.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah, good idea. Now, I came across this when I was writing my Edessa book because it's contained within, yes, that's the Kerala Church, I think it is.
Yes.
Part of the, what do they call it? The Malabar Church? I forget what it's called. The Malabar Church.
Malabar, yeah.
Malabar, yes. These are all sort of new words to me because I hadn't come across the Malabar Church until very recently, which is the Edessan Church in India. As I was saying, this is a part of the doctrine of Adai, which is a central part of my Jesus King of Edessa book. And that doesn't really explain exactly what happened. So the doctrine of Adai says that Thomas sent Adai over to Edessa to talk with the king of Edessa. So we have this strong link between Jerusalem and Edessa in the doctrine of Adai. And the characters we get are Thomas, who sent the apostle, Adai, who's the apostle, and Ananias, who is the ambassador from Edessa. But then we start reading some of the other versions of this story, and we find that Thomas has other names, which we can get from several of the other apocryphal gospels. So if we read Moses of Corine, and Acts of Thaddeus, and Michael the Syrian, and Eusebius, and the Acts of Thaddeus, we get a slightly different story. So the story there is that it was Jesus who sent the apostle to Edessa, and his name was Judas, Thomas, Didymus, Thaddeus, Lebbaeus. So, and that disciple, if you read all of the various different explanations, that disciple was the twin brother of Jesus. So Thomas Didymus just means the twin. And there are several different books that I've been looking at on this. And so we have to look at the Thayer Greek dictionary, which says that all of these people were the same people. Adam Clarke, the theologian, he says that they are all the same person. The Catholic Encyclopedia says that Jude or Judas was indeed the brother of James and Jesus. And then we have the Gospels themselves, who says the brethren of Jesus are called James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, who are the same names of the same people. And then we get the Acts of Thomas and various other books, which indicate that this person was the twin brother of Jesus. So Jesus had a twin. That's what Thomas Didymus means. And he went to Edessa, and he was conversing with the king of Edessa and bringing letters to and from the king of Edessa down to Jerusalem. So that story has been fairly well known, but some of the other texts, like the Acts of Thaddeus and the Acts of Thomas, say that this same character went to India. So now we get a slightly different side to this story, where he didn't just go to Edessa, he went to India. And he went to the south of India, to Kerala, and set up a Christian, he wouldn't have been Christian in that era. He would have set up a Nazarene church of Jesus and James in the south of India. And from that, we find that there is this church in India, which was supposedly founded in AD 52 by Judas Thomas Didymus, who was the twin brother of Jesus. And that church still exists even now. And I've been finding more and more information that this has been known about for some time. So Judas was supposed to have died there. He was martyred there in AD 72, I think it was.
Yep.
And his bones were initially sent to Mylapore, which is near Madras, I think.
Yep.
And then his bones were sent back to Edessa in AD 232. So again, we see this very strong connection between this St Thomas guy who went out to India and Edessa, because his bones were sent back to Edessa. And then we get Eusebius, who says that Thomas came from Edessa. He calls him Thaddeus, but Thaddeus is one of the names of Judas Thomas. Thaddeus came from Edessa in the first place, and then went to India, did his evangelism, died there, and his bones were sent back to Edessa. We have these very, very strong links with Edessa, which is interesting because Judas Thomas Didymus, if he came from Edessa, he is the brother of Jesus. So if he came from Edessa, what about the Jesus character? It rather suggests that Jesus came from Edessa as well. And we have this from Eusebius. So this is going back, this is all sort of, most of these apocryphal gospels are all sort of 3rd century. So it's pretty early stuff. This is not late, it's fairly early. And we get this very, very strong link with Edessa. And of course, that's exactly what I've said in my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, that Jesus did indeed come from Edessa. He was a prince and then a king of Edessa. And yet we have this long-standing tradition that, yes, he did indeed come from Edessa. And the book I've been looking at is, let me have a look at the front of this. It's called A Short History of the Church of Malabar. And this is just opening it up. This was based upon, I'm looking at the foreword here from this book. It says, a history of the Church of Malabar from the time of its being first discovered by the Portuguese in the year 1501. Giving an account of the persecutions and the violent methods of the Roman prelates to reduce them in this church to the subjugation of the Church of Rome. So this was, it was first written in 1599. So they were first discovered in 1501. The book was first written in Portuguese in 1599. And it was then translated into English by Michael Geddes of the Cathedral Church of Sarum, which is down in Salisbury in the south of England, printed in London in 1694. So this is quite an old tradition, even within English, that people have known about the Edessan church in India since year 1700. So for 320 years, this has been known. And I didn't really find out about it until quite recently, that we have these strong links back to Edessa. But they don't really explain. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just
Now I can hear you.
Funnily enough, I mentioned to you a few months ago that I'd read a book called Jesus Lived in India, which was written by Holger Kirsten. And there's also another book called Jesus in Kashmir, The Lost Tomb, that was written by Suzanne Olsen.
Oh, yes, Suzanne.
So, but there seems to be this conjecture that it was Jesus that went to this part of the south of India. Whereas
and up to Kashmir as well, which is in the north of India as well, because there is another tradition that Thomas went to the north of India, which is a separate tradition, that he was up within the Parthian Empire, because he was evangelizing in the Parthian Empire, and that stretched right up into modern Pakistan and Afghanistan at the time, was sort of ruled by Parthia, and that he was up in that region. And yes, Suzanne Olsen has been on the trail of this for years. I've been discussing this. I haven't actually talked to her for about 10 years, but we used to discuss this quite often. And she was actually living up in Kashmir, trying to find the history of Jesus in Kashmir. And I think she was on the trail of Jesus's brother. Because it's pointedly said, if you read the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas say that that Thomas didn't just look like Jesus, he was confused with Jesus because they were twins. They looked identical. They were identical twins. And it also says that Thomas was sold into, as it were, slavery. This is how he got to India. He was sold into slavery as a carpenter. The illusion is obvious, that here is a guy who looked like Jesus, and he was also a carpenter, and he was sold into indentured with this king in southern India.
Wow.
And then he has several portions which are very similar to portions we see in the other books we've been looking at. So Thomas is working as a carpenter, but then he becomes an architect, which is not surprising because tecton means architect. It doesn't. Yeah, tecton is what Jesus was called. It doesn't mean carpenter, it means architect. So he becomes the architect for the king, who is creating a palace for the king. But of course, he's not creating a palace. He's spending all the money on the poor instead. And he's creating a palace for the king in heaven. You probably recognize the parable from the Gospels. And of course, that's a direct link back to Matthew 6:19, which says that Jesus said, "Lay up not for yourselves treasures upon earth, where the moths and rust will corrupt them, and where thieves will break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust does corrupt."
Is
it's
this
exactly the same story?
The same quote that's accredited to Monobasis on Wikipedia?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it is. So we get the exact same quote from the history of the Adiabeni kings from Josephus Flavius. And of course, I equate the Adiabeni kings with Edessa because Adiabeni was Edessa. And Josephus says of the Adiabeni monarchs, King Monobasis replied, "My fathers have stored up below but I'm storing up above. My father stored in a place which can be tampered with, but I have stored in a place which cannot be tampered with. My father stored something which produces no fruits, but I have stored something which does produce fruits. And so it's exactly the same story again. So we get this in three places, at least in three. We get it in the story of the Adiabeni kings, who are the Edessan kings. We get it in the story of Jesus, who was an Edessan king, according to my research. And now we get it in the story of Thomas, who came from Edessa, and his bones were sent back to Edessa. So he was obviously connected to Edessa and was a twin of Jesus. We get the same story three times, and it all is centering around Edessa as being the primary place that all of these stories came out of. So yes, it is rather reinforcing the fact that Edessa was central to these particular stories.
It's fascinating stuff, isn't it? It's very, very exciting. You know.
It is, because it's the more I look at it, the more sort of is dropping out of this new side of this research, this new strand of this research. I mean, even the Madame Ageria, who I quote because she went to Edessa. This was in the 4th century. She was a solo traveler in a day when a lady could actually travel in the Near East alone, you know. And she went up to Edessa from Jerusalem. She went to Jerusalem, as they all did, on their pilgrimages. She went to Jerusalem, and then she went up to Edessa. But she also went to the tomb of St Thomas, because he had a tomb in Edessa. And this would have been the 4th century sometime. And she says, we arrived at Edessa, and on our arrival, we straight away went to the church and the memorial of St Thomas. There we read also things concerning St Thomas himself. The church there is very great and very beautiful, and well worthy to be the house of a god. And there was much I desired to see, and it was necessary for me to make 3 days' stay there in Edessa, looking at the Church of Thomas. So it was obviously quite famous in a fairly early era. This is in the 4th century, with her traveling up to Edessa. It took her 26 days to get to Edessa. That's how long it took in those days to travel between locations. So Jerusalem to Edessa took 26 stops, 26 days.
Fantastic. Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this particular new line of research unfolds. You know, it's absolutely fascinating.
Yes,
do you have any plans to go there at all and to visit it for yourself?
Well, I would like to. Well, I'm off to Edessa in October, so I'll be going to Edessa then. So yes, it might be nice to use this extra information to have a look in this side of it. Unfortunately, most of the archaeology in Edessa has been built upon and ruined. Unfortunately, there's not much left there. Most of the churches have been, in fact, every single one of the churches has been turned into a mosque, because there are no Christians left in Edessa. And it's very difficult to get in those mosques. I will try a bit harder this time, but they're not mosques that are open to visitors. So it's very difficult to get in. It would be nice to see what's remaining within those churches. I did do a tour of the outside of them last time I was there, but couldn't see anything of particular relevance in the external architecture. The trouble is with Islam, I suppose we did the same a little bit during the Reformation, but they destroy any icons of the saints or whatever. So anything that is vaguely a idol an image of a person is always destroyed. So you get a lot of destruction there. You can't see what's happened, which is a shame. So there's not much archaeology to see in Edessa, but I will certainly try and do as much as I can.
Fantastic. Okay, shall we leave it there, Ralph? That was a fascinating episode. Really enjoyed that one. Thank you very much. Please like, share and subscribe, everyone. And we'll be back in the near future with another episode. Cheers, Ralph.
Thank you.